All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the Modern Web Podcast. My name is Rob Ocel. I'm a developer at this.labs. We're a software consulting firm that specializes in front-end JavaScript development. Today, we have on the docket to discuss GraphQL, which you have probably heard about recently. Joining me to talk about GraphQL is my co-host, Tracy Lee, who's a founder at this. You can find her on Twitter at LadyLeet. Hey, Tracy. We also have Uri Goldshtein, who's the founder of The Guild, which is a group of open source developers. You can find him on Twitter at Uri Goldshtein. So hi, Uri.
Hi.
And we also have with us Tanmai Gopal, who's the founder of Hasura, and you can find him on Twitter at Tanmai Go, G-O. How's it going?
Hi. Good.
Good. All right, so the first topic that we want to talk about with GraphQL, I mean, I feel like there are probably very few people who haven't heard of GraphQL at all. It had a really big year in 2018, and I feel like when I was on Twitter, everybody's like top 5 things people should be learning in 2019, GraphQL was always on the list, right? So I went around and I saw on the NPM.js like 2018 state of development, they said that GraphQL was in hyper growth, and they were like, this is something you need to know, right? On the JavaScript survey, it was like something on the order of like 20% used it and would use it again, and 60% hadn't used it, but they wanted to learn about it, right? So GraphQL, very, very hot right now. So I just thought, to start out, kind of what is your idea of the state of GraphQL, the state of the GraphQL union, as it were? Like what happened in 2018? What's going on in 2019? Like, why is this so big and so hot right now? Uri, you want to start us out?
Sure, I'll try. So I think there's every time someone asks about that, I think the best resource to look at is there's the Lee Byron master plan, which is in every, I think, GraphQL conference when he gives like a keynote, he shows that, and he had this like master plan of how GraphQL can become from like this really cool technology to like an ubiquitous thing that everyone knows what it's about and it can run everywhere. And I think last time I heard him talk about it, like, and I think even the first time I heard him talk about it, like the rate of which GraphQL becomes, like is growing and is being adopted by more and more companies is crazy. It's like growing really fast. It's growing really fast in companies where you wouldn't expect new technologies to grow really, really fast, which is, for me, I think, the most exciting thing. So since, Facebook has open sourced it and did tremendous job in the spec itself and the toolings around it, then Apollo came. And Apollo, I think, took the both the toolings and the promotion of GraphQL to really the next level. Like they did so much work in talking about it, explaining it, rethinking some concepts, building libraries and tools around it. It's tremendous. And I think now in 2018, what happened is that, very large companies and large code bases and all kinds of various companies started actually adopting it and using it in production. And again, I think it happened in a rate that most people didn't expect it to be like so, widely used. And I think now it's in a point where I think, we get to see more and more advanced use cases of GraphQL, and we get to see more advanced toolings being needed and being provided, and the conversations around GraphQL becomes, from one hand, like very interesting about very advanced use case, but on the other hand, there's all those new people coming in, which I think we're also kind of like, we just moved, everyone moved so fast that I think there's a lot of cracks that we can feel in. So I don't know.
Great. And Tanmai, I mean, just to kind of riff off that, I mean, where your position, where Hasura's position, right at the middle, like, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. I think. I think Uri's bang on, and with the way he described it, and I am my view is a little narrower in the use cases that are happening with GraphQL, and I'm relatively newer to the GraphQL ecosystem as compared to Uri. But my sense is that a lot of people are just starting to figure GraphQL out for the first time. And so you're kind of seeing this bimodal distribution of people who are very experienced with GraphQL and doing all kinds of crazy things. And then you have this other set of people who are just like, what is happening? What is GraphQL? How do I do ABCD? Oh yes, graph databases. I've heard of graph databases. They're really popular. And then you tell them, no, it's not. It's got nothing to do with graph databases. It's a spec for an API. And so there's obviously that's happening, and that is just natural, right? It's not good or bad. It's just natural for any kind of technology that's being adopted super fast. I think the most interesting thing for me, and especially building on what Uri said about how you're seeing GraphQL adoption in companies that you would not expect to use something as new as GraphQL. I think that being a part of this GraphQL wave is an amazing experience, because I'm firsthand seeing how technology that changes process is so powerful. And that's a slightly vague thing to say, but like to make that a little more specific, it's what GraphQL solves as a specification, right? If you look at GraphQL, the spec, it's simple. It's not groundbreaking. It's not like, oh my goodness, this is the most amazing thing that we've done in the last 40, 50 years. It's not that, right? It's not complex. It's not super cool. But it's beautiful, because what it's doing is it's solving this fundamental problem, which was this power and responsibility distribution between a front end and a back end team. And over the last decade, and especially over the last 5 years, you've seen so much of that power shift from backend to the front end. And you're seeing that, you're looking at the backend ecosystem getting SaaSified, moving to the cloud. Most of the APIs that you're looking at, building, you're not building things in-house anymore, right? A lot of that backend work is getting shifted into products and services and stuff like that. And you have more and more people working on the front end, and the front ends are becoming more and more powerful. And the front end of the application is where the business is, right? And the rest of the industry is telling you the same thing, right? You're seeing the same thing with Angular and React and Vue, and the crazy amount of innovation, the speed that's happening in the front end frameworks is telling you the same thing. And GraphQL is a technology that solves the problem of the backend team being in control of APIs, and the front end team having to wait for the backend team to build things, to iterate on things, to modify their APIs. That process that was slow, that process of documenting, using, and integrating APIs, is in a way fundamentally solved by the GraphQL spec, in a way that nothing has, by the combination of a few simple things. And I think that's the reason behind this huge GraphQL momentum, and that's the reason behind this adoption in production that we are seeing, right? Not just hipster adoption that is common, like people with long hair, not just those kinds of people, but also all the other people, and that's amazing, and that's what I'm super excited about, and especially seeing. I'm excited about seeing traditional companies moving to GraphQL, right? Not the Facebooks and the Twitters, right? They're always on the cutting edge, but everybody else is moving to GraphQL, and that's going to be super exciting.
So I guess like that's kind of, I mean, it wasn't necessarily where we're going to go next, but I'm really interested to poke into that concept a little bit more, which is, there are going to be people that didn't see this coming, or at least have been a little bit unaware of it. And now they see GraphQL mentioned everywhere, and they're like, oh, great, another fad, right? Another buzzword, another thing that we have to migrate to, and we'll migrate away from it in a year. I guess like, and maybe Yuri, you can start, like, why is this not a fad? Like, why is this something that's here to stay? Is there anything else about it that is resonating on the projects that you've seen, or the teams that you've spoken to, that shows that this kind of is popular, on its merits, not just because it's new?
I think it's a great question, because everyone, when they see first like a technology, they're like, I don't know, in our community you have this tendency of like, oh, it's another thing, tomorrow it's going to be the next thing and everything. I think for me, GraphQL represents a very smart abstraction when you look on data, and I think something happened, in few years ago where, when I used to work on like, I don't know, .NET, full stack .NET applications, and at some point we moved to the web and we got, something happened between the connection between the client and the data source, or the client and the server. We lost the types, and I think that when people ask me, a lot of people are asking me, okay, so after I explain GraphQL to people and everything, they're like, okay, so what is bad about GraphQL? What is, you always, when you ask someone that advocates for a technology, you always ask, okay, so what is not good with it? And I think usually my answer is the other way around. I don't think GraphQL is so amazing. I do think it's amazing, but I think it's being so successful right now because how we do REST API today is so weird. Like, how come, we just call some random endpoint, that endpoint can send us some data, the whole way that we are used to do client-server communication today is broken. When a client calls the server has no idea what the client actually needs, and the client has no idea what they're gonna get. This is the weirdest type of communication you can think about, and somehow we made it a standard. So by putting some kind of standard and some kind of types along that, on top of that, we get so many benefits that, I don't know, programmers like myself that came from, before, I don't know, that did a lot of development, before this age, this JavaScript REST age, we were used to those things, and I think that's why I think it's so powerful. It's not GraphQL just embodies, in my opinion, so many good architectural concepts that we lost along the way. And I think what's really special about GraphQL, and this is something that has to be said for the people who created GraphQL, the abstraction is so clean and so nice. Today, we build open source tools to generate other types of protocols from GraphQL, as GraphQL is the base for it. And just now I understand how powerful really GraphQL is. It's just such a clean and nice abstraction, but it's so powerful because it embodies so many capabilities that we used to get from many toolings that been there before.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting though that you talk about types, because another one of the technologies that really popped off in 2018, especially at the end of 2018 and now is TypeScript on the front end. So this seems like this is a really hot topic across all of web development. And I think with TypeScript you get all kinds of benefits, obvious benefits that everyone is talking about on their own code bases. But with GraphQL you get type safety from a team you never met, or over a backend team in another department of your company. So it's so much more powerful. Those are much more valuable typings than typings inside your own code. And not to mention other stuff, which is GraphQL, validates those typings at runtime, which is extremely powerful. Use those. You have the ability to not only validate, but do many transformations and things like that with GraphQL at runtime, which is, I think, part of the biggest strength of GraphQL. Awesome. So I wanted to bounce back to the front half of the bimodal distribution, I guess. The set of people that have heard and keep hearing about GraphQL, they just haven't looked at it yet, right? Their team doesn't use it. They're like, I'll get to it when I get to it. And I think what they encounter is, like, I found a really cool GitHub repository. I think it's awesome-GraphQL, and it's just a gigantic list of libraries and things like that. And it's really cool. But I mean, it could be really easy for someone to get a bit overwhelmed with trying to understand, like, what is GraphQL versus what is Apollo versus what is Relay, even some of the libraries like the GraphQL modules or the inspector. And I think just to take this even one step further, what's interesting is that this seems to be, like you said, changing processes. We have front-end technologies for GraphQL, back-end technologies, and now even like DevOps stuff like GitHub integrations and things like that. So I guess, how does somebody that's just breaking into this space make sense of all the libraries that are popping up and where to focus first? And
Yeah,
Tanmai, did you have anything about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. I think so I mean, the specific answer to that in terms of like what resources to look at, and kind of how to go about your GraphQL journey, I think the best way to get started is, so I find that the introduction on GraphQL, on GraphQLJS.org, the first GraphQL kind of resource that came out, the official webpage. I remember reading it a few years ago, and I looked at it and I said, what and why? I mean, what? It's let me just give me a second to maybe like read out the line that it has, and it's funny, and it uses the word type system, and it uses the word it's a right, there you go. I mean, and it's a, and it puts you off, right? And I remember the first time that I got GraphQL was when I just used a GraphQL API. And after using the GraphQL API, I kind of hit like right click on inspect element, and I went to the network tab, and I just looked at the request that was happening underneath. And with that starting point, that suddenly gives me a framework to start understanding everything else. And I remember that journey fairly vividly. And so what I recommend to people who are starting off is, don't worry about setting things up. Just go find a GraphQL API somewhere, and just start using it, and just start understanding how it works and why it works and what kind of things you can do with it. And then once you have that, depending on what you want to do, like, are you the backend person? Are you the front end person? Are you the person kind of in the middle that's kind of setting up this gateway kind of thing? Are you the architect trying to convince your team? Depending on that, you kind of now need to start looking at different resources. And there's good enough material on every front, right? There's tons of courses, there's tons of videos that help you get started with what you want to do. But the first thing is to just kind of use the GraphQL API and just kind of figure out how the GraphQL API actually works underneath, and then that suddenly everything starts making sense. That was kind of my journey, but
yeah, I think maybe for me it was a bit different, but I agree. I think first of all, the first graphical experience is amazing. Like graphical is so self-explanatory, it's so powerful. Once you give the first lecture I gave on GraphQL, you just open graphical and then everyone is like, oh, okay, that's cool. And I think recently OneGraph open sourced their own version of graphical. I forgot what's the name.
It's OneGraphical.
OneGraphical. And it's really cool. I think it's even cooler. It's even simpler. Like for a beginner, you just get a list of all the things you can query, and you just check mark it, and that's really, really cool. And I think recently there's a guy called Carlos that made a version of the SpaceX SpaceX REST API in GraphQL, and he added this thing, and it's, I think, a great place to start from, just from exploring and clicking things, and that's really, really cool. So I think that's a great start. For me personally, what I really liked about GraphQL is the concepts behind it. And the first time I heard about it with all the concepts was from a talk from Byron. There's a talk that I would really, one of the, there's the obvious talk where he explains GraphQL, like presents GraphQL and explains it. He has another talk, which I don't know if a lot of people are knowing. I always just Google Byron render 2016. And this talk is about a lot of different concepts, but I think, and it's a very general architectural talk, but I think it's a talk that puts for me, it placed everything in place. Where GraphQL fits in the system, how data flows across all the stack. And yeah, so I couldn't recommend the talk enough.
It's funny that you say that. Honestly, I think I know the talk that you're talking about, and it's the one I share with everybody. It's my all-time favorite too. So maybe we'll see if we can link it somehow, like in the show notes or something. And to go back to the OneGraph thing, I had that in my notes as well. You know, they just released a blog post, I think it was a week ago, that talked about how they onboard new developers or new users that are new to GraphQL, and it goes through the OneGraph, I think it's Graph IQL Explorer or something like that, their visual approach to using GraphQL. Would definitely recommend that blog post for people that are that want to see how they onboard people, which is probably useful if you're trying to get up to speed as well. You know, I guess what's interesting is when I heard about GraphQL, and I feel like the way that GraphQL is always presented, because GraphQL itself is the spec, it's always taught in terms of the query, like how you construct a query and how you actually get data from the backend. Like, do you guys feel that that's still the most effective way to draw people in, or do you think that there are other like salient sales pitches or places that people should be introduced to GraphQL, the concept? Because I know, like, for backend people, it might be really potent just to understand, you know, how relatively easy it is, like how little you have to do necessarily to kind of implement some of these GraphQL, you know, interfaces and things like that. That might be even more interesting than the queries. I don't know. What are you guys' thoughts? Are queries still the best way to onboard and to intrigue people about GraphQL?
I think it depends, like, who you're aiming to, and I think, like what we said at the beginning, there's so many people who needs to touch GraphQL and are, you know, they're in the process of getting familiar with it. Like, one thing that I wanted to say before that I didn't say, I think there's, you know, one of the things, you know, you can open GraphQL on like an existing thing. I think, you know, what used to be a really cool thing to start learning to program was to use Firebase or, you know, something like that, something like a magical backend, everything. The problem there was, you know, I think it encouraged you for bad practices, and you would probably also get stuck with one provider doing what, you know, something very specific. I think the current wave of really cool technologies that gives you developer productivity, you know, for apps, like, you know, Hazura is like the best example, I guess. It's I think it's so much more powerful than what we used to have with Firebase. Firebase was amazing. I think, you know, tools like Hazura or like everything that is GraphQL based, backend as a service, and I don't know, probably I'm going to stop talking about Hazura now, but because probably I'm going to say a lot of wrong things. But I think this is so much more powerful because you get a very powerful, very simple, very elegant experience to start with, but you're probably going to reuse those things when you're going to scale your app. And I think this is, like, you know, really, really amazing. And I forgot what was your question, but I just had to. It just.
I think on the query side, I still think it's the most powerful way to get teams hooked to GraphQL. I still think, and this goes back to my point about the power shifting to the front end developers, because I think once the owners of teams, so I'm not talking about teams where I'm not talking about good teams, right? There's good teams. Good teams will always move towards good technology. That will always happen. You don't have to do anything. You should ideally not touch them. They will do it themselves. But I'm talking about teams where you need to now say, hey, you know, you need to pitch GraphQL. And there, I would always, the way you would look at it is, you know, there's a team. The team has a product owner that's responsible for building things fast. That's responsible for like getting productive. To that team and to that owner and the stakeholders, I would show the front end developers' experience getting better, because that's the biggest force. That's the biggest force for improving the API experience, because there are fundamental things that just sucked about using REST APIs for powerful front-end apps. Making multiple API calls, being inflexible with API calls, the documentation experience, not having types. It was a nightmare. Like, it's a nightmare. Like Uri said, right? It's amazing how far we got with REST. Right? And that's amazing. So that conversation is still the best way to introduce GraphQL. And I think it's kind of one of those things where you can't please everybody. And I still meet the kinds of backend developers who haven't bought into GraphQL yet. So they are very similar to the REST developers who were trying to convince the SOAP people. because the SOAP people were like, dude, SOAP is the best thing. And the rest people were like, no, what are you saying? Like, SOAP is unreadable. And then the SOAP people said, no, but SOAP is 10 times more powerful than REST, right? And you're seeing the same thing with REST versus GraphQL people today. But that's going to change. And that's just a matter of time. And I think it's okay to not have to convince them so much, because they will kind of gradually buy in. It's just they will see it. They'll be forced to see it. They'll look at it and they'll be like, you know what? This is actually nice. I was hating on it unnecessarily. This is actually pretty cool. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, so I'll just add for that. I now remember the question, so I'll add my perspective. I agree. I think that the shift will come from the front-end developers and the product managers. They would be the ones to push the technology, whether the backend people want it or not. For me, in my day-to-day job, I need to talk and I need to convince and I need to work with a lot of mostly backend developers. And there's a point in time where backend developers get GraphQL, and then it's like, okay, I get it now, and it's amazing. And I think then, in my opinion, it gives more benefits for the backend developers. Like, GraphQL is amazing for backend developers for structuring backend applications, for managing, orchestrating and managing multiple data sources, microservices. The power that you get is so much, and the possible toolings are so much more powerful. You can get caching on the field level. You suddenly, again, everything you get when you start to understand types. You can get error resilience. You can send a query, maybe one field will fail, you still can receive a partial response. And I think, and the most important thing is the backend developers, like, the best selling point is like, you don't care what the front-end developer needs anymore. You expose your data. I mean, but it saves you so much work. Like, I see in so many companies, the main thing that they work on, the backend developer, like we say backend developers like it's one big giant job. Like, a lot of the backend code that is being written today is just custom controllers to try to correlate to whatever the front-end developer needs at that particular moment. All this work is done. You don't need to do that anymore. Stop doing that. Do all the things that you like to do. And the nice thing is also, this is the work that the backend developers hate to do the most. So I think if I could give, I don't know how, but if I could give a magical experience for the backend developers to explain GraphQL, I think, I don't know, if someone has an idea, I would love to help. And I think this is why GraphQL grows so fast. Well, maybe not. Like, I think it grows so fast because what you said. I think because of the product developers that pushing it and everything. But I think it makes so much sense for backend developers, like real, true, smart backend developers.
Yeah, I think one of the experiences that I found that clicks with backend developers a little bit. I mean, so this is apart from the technical awesomeness, right? So you pitch the backend developer about the technical awesomeness of GraphQL, and they're like, "Cool, I buy it." But from kind of like a business boring value prop kind of thing that clicks is when I talk to developers and when I talk to some teams and I say, backend people, how would you like to not maintain documentation? Like, what if we said, don't write a Swagger spec, and don't write these Google Sheets and share documentations, or don't create API collections and share them? What if we said none of that? Would you like to be a part of this world? And I think then kind of forcing them to empathize with the good aspects of GraphQL, which kind of lead from this process productivity, that I've seen some success with that, but not too much. Like, I still think like the time when they suddenly get GraphQL is amazing. And I'm not sure what that experience is or how to force that to happen. But I feel that in some contexts, I can kind of lead the conversation if I talk about the process benefit of saying no documentation. Imagine that. Imagine nobody calling you in the middle of the night saying that this API is returning the wrong type of data, right? Like, so I've seen that work a little bit, but
Yeah, I think a counter argument for that is like, most people that they write Java applications with Spring Boot or something, they will tell you, well, I'm generating everything anyway from my Java classes, and I get Swagger definitions and everything is there. But that's kind of true, because once you, again, like if you write the perfect RESTful endpoint, that's fine. But then once you start customizing and everyone starts customizing, that's when the problem happens. And again, when you start customizing is when you start writing code that backend developers just don't like to write for obvious reasons, because it feels weird. I feel like in our back of our minds, we knew REST was weird. We knew the fact that we write this manual code to adjust for this mobile app or just whatever is querying my thing right now. We knew it was wrong, but we couldn't. That was it, REST. That's what we had. That's the standard. And now finally we have something that is like, okay, we can do it smarter. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's imagine that we have just convinced everybody, right? So now everybody is an acolyte of GraphQL, and suddenly we have a lot of APIs to update. So for a team that has a database and they have their collection of APIs, maybe their REST or what have you, what conversations do they need to have, or what do those first steps look like? Like REST and GraphQL, will there still be a place for some REST APIs? Do they have to go offline for 6 months, update everything, and then bring it all back online? Like, what does migration look like? Kind of help people kind of understand what they're about to get themselves into.
We go for this. This is your land.
I think I just last week we released a library in that sense, but I think before that, first of all, I think what I really admire about GraphQL is that it's a very practical technology. It doesn't tell you migrate everything. You can start with one single endpoint, one painful endpoint. Like every time I go to a company, I ask, okay, let's do a POC, let's do an experiment. Give me like your most horrible endpoint, or the most painful one, the one that takes the longest and feels like the slowest, or the ones that you need to write the most amount of code to get something into the client. And start with that. Just write one single endpoint with GraphQL. All the rest keep doing with REST. Keep your authentication or whatever you used to do that. And just with this one single endpoint, start migrating. And then, once they do that, very quickly, they end up like putting it in more and more places. So I think, first of all, like the best thing about GraphQL is that like it works on top of everything. So when you end up building that endpoint, you can just query the other REST endpoint you queried before. You just now get, you do it a bit smarter, and you get all the benefits of GraphQL that I'm going to specify now. And that's great. What I'm saying that like what I wanted, the thing that we released last week is that what happens if you now, let's say, your backend developers, or you're a backend developer and you completely convinced in GraphQL and you moved everything to GraphQL, but not all your clients are actually, want to use GraphQL. Maybe it's one app. Maybe you have third-party applications, third-party partners that you want to work with, and you still want to expose REST APIs. Then I think, again, because GraphQL, and that made me learn a lot about GraphQL, because GraphQL is such a powerful abstraction, you can generate from GraphQL. It's like GraphQL is kind of like a superset of the tools that you would get from REST. So now you can actually take your GraphQL server and generate completely fully typed, fully documented REST API, REST endpoints. Sorry for the self promotion, but it's just it's an open source library for free, so it's I'm not making money out of it. But it's called SOFA API because SOFA is the easiest way to REST, and you take whatever GraphQL endpoint you have. It can be your own GraphQL endpoint or even like a remote GraphQL endpoint, and it just generates complete RESTful API for you. So even if you still want to support for whatever use case you want REST endpoints, you can still do that without writing all the things that you need to do in order to create REST endpoints. So that was for me a very powerful realization of really how powerful GraphQL is. I can really create any REST demand with simply GraphQL.
Great, Tanmai. Did you have anything else to add to that about kind of?
I think without getting into too many details, I think it's important for people to realize, and maybe there's maybe more conversation needs to happen around this, especially when people are evaluating GraphQL, that doing GraphQL and REST together at the same time is not hard. It's actually very easy to do incremental migrations, right? And you know, like Uri said, you have part of your backend is suddenly a GraphQL API. Your client can do a little bit of GraphQL, can do a little bit of REST, and you know, it's fine. So that kind of makes sense. But and I think that's important for people to know, so that they don't think about it as, oh my goodness, we have to move to GraphQL. It's going to take you know, months and years. But you know what? The adoption that you're seeing today is kind of happening because people have been doing that incremental migration really quickly. Most of the large companies, when they tell you we've moved to GraphQL, they're not 100% GraphQL. It's impossible to be 100% GraphQL. If you go to Facebook and you log in on Facebook and you right click and you see how they're doing the Facebook login, it's a form. It's application X, like www form encoded. It's not even REST JSON, right? It's a form encoded API that's making the login happen, right? So it's fine. Like the migration process is nothing stressful, and that's, I think, important for people to know as well.
Cool. So that's so that half of the bimodal distribution, they're off migrating right now. So we have another half here that already has their GraphQL system kind of running. And you know, you were saying that the people that have kind of been here now, they've been innovating, and they're discovering as they're putting this into production that there are some really interesting things they can do in GraphQL that they might not realize that they could do right away. So this is something that I am not going to have anything to say about. but I'm looking to you guys to kind of wow us. Like, what are some of the sort of maybe things that aren't obvious to people, but things that people have found that you can do that are really exciting with GraphQL that you might see more of this year?
Uri, would you like to go first?
Sure. Even though I think you have probably a lot of really cool stuff to say about the intersections between GraphQL and SQL, but I won't talk about that. But I think for me, well, one big subject that I think Apollo is helping a lot to push, and also Facebook, is the GraphQL on the client side. And I think this is a very, very important subject. And I think for me, again, when I go to Lee Byron's talk and about the architectural thing in Render 2016, it makes sense suddenly GraphQL makes sense on a bigger scale. I always say that, like, Facebook open sourced their stuff in the wrong order. So they open sourced React, and then they open sourced I'll say that I'm not going to say anything bad about Facebook and what they did. Like, with all the respect for myself, but I just say that just for illustration, they open sourced React, they open sourced Flux, and then they open sourced GraphQL. Where I think just by chance, if it was the other way around, I think we would skip a big let's say, in my opinion, and I wouldn't say anti-pattern, but a very common way where people today use state management and local cache on their client. When Facebook open sourced the Flux architecture, the way that they did Flux on Facebook, that state was typed and was normalized. So you could actually get a lot of the benefits from GraphQL only on the front end. Each component could just query the data that the component needs from that local store. And that local store will go and fetch the data from the backend. Now, when we talk about scalable component architecture, without that, how can you really create a scalable component architecture? If you have 20,000 or 60,000 components, and they all end up querying one central store, that it's just a blob of data and there's no order there, that's not scalable. Like someone needs to, I wonder if someone ever asked, like, why doesn't Facebook uses Redux? And I think the reason is there was something in between the part when they open source Flux and when they open source GraphQL and Relay. And that is something that I think the React community is now picking up. There's more and more people who understand the concept of normalized cache on the client and the power of GraphQL as a query language on the client, which is extremely powerful. I think other communities like the Angular community are a bit slower in understanding that. And I hope they would pick up this thing, because I think it's extremely powerful thing. Like GraphQL on the client is just so powerful. And I hope that people would understand those concepts more than that. I just gave a talk about an amazing library from the Apollo ecosystem, the Apollo Link REST, which even if your server is not GraphQL, you can already use GraphQL just on your front end while querying your server with REST APIs. And just with that, you get so many benefits. So I think this whole area of client-side GraphQL is something that I really wish more people would explore. And I think definitely for large scale, large companies, large code bases, it makes so much sense. And I think that's one of the, core parts of the architecture and the component-based architecture that people are sometimes missing.
Very cool. And Tanmai, how about you? What's some of the more interesting things that you've seen?
Yeah, I think one of the things that GraphQL is going to change a lot with the way people think are going to be use cases around real-time stuff. And I think GraphQL has made real-time primitives accessible to people at a scale that is unprecedented. And before this, real-time was always like, what is real-time? How does it work? Can I just poll for stuff and maybe fake real-time? And it's always been hard for people to understand. But I think because GraphQL comes with subscriptions, and I mean the GraphQL subscription spec is not the hard work. The hard work is being done by people who are kind of building the GraphQL clients and servers that support real-time. But that's happening. And as that's happening, that's kind of giving these real-time primitives that are accessible to people in a way that wasn't before. And I am extremely excited about that. One of the small things that I'll zoom into quickly here that I think is super exciting is, how everybody talks about event-driven backends and having asynchronous backends because that's how they really scale, and like having monolithic systems doesn't scale and whatnot. And everybody likes saying that, but very few people get to move towards that because the amount of tooling that you need to set up on the backend and front end is very hard. To take a scenario, right? Imagine that when something happens on the backend, I execute a serverless function or I run some API. It goes and does something and it modifies the backend, and that's great. Setting that up on the backend is great because we've been building complicated databases, event systems, CQRS. That entire ecosystem has been evolving over the last 10 years, and that evolution is good. But whenever this asynchronous stuff happens in the backend, it has always been a pain for front-end applications to consume that information as it happens in the backend, right? This idea of something happens asynchronously and I get to update my UI as that happens on the backend has been hard for people to understand. And I think with GraphQL subscriptions especially, that's becoming easier and easier for people. So we're going to see lots of activity and excitement in real-time use cases with GraphQL, which is still a relatively young ecosystem. People have kind of done the other stuff in GraphQL, but I think the real-time use cases and making yourself think about your entire application in an event-first way, that becomes possible with GraphQL. This is something people talk about and they feel and like, hey, this is very cool. It's completely event-driven. It's reactive. It's real-time, but it's hard to do. And now it's becoming accessible to a very large number of people. And I'm very excited about that kind of use case with GraphQL.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just add that I think one of the amazing thing or the very beautiful things in GraphQL is the client says what they want and then the servers try to fulfill it. And I think that's very powerful. And I think that's also gives us the opportunity to start talking about the difference between live queries and subscriptions. And I think, like you said, I think it's extremely exciting. And I think we're just getting started there. There's so much more work that we can do there. And I think it's, maybe 2019 will be the year for that.
Great. I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, that concept is really fascinating because I think event-driven conceptualization, especially on the front end, has been really big, right? RxJS, different libraries like that. People are really trying to think about how these UIs are built from these combinations of events. And it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if this is the right way to conceptualize it, but as you were talking, it's almost like previously with those, I was constrained to the events that I generated on my local device. But through the benefits of what you're talking about with these subscriptions, it's almost as though now we're kind of sharing this event scenario because my events could trigger updates on the server, which could trigger events, which propagate down to you, which, we kind of participate in this shared event-driven architecture. And that definitely does seem like a really interesting space to see what people can come up with as far as use cases and things that suddenly make difficult problems very simple this year. So for people that have been kind of fascinated by this, one of the things that we always do with these podcasts is talk about ways that the community can get involved. People that are listening to this, both on the people that are using it at their companies and people that are just hearing about it now, where can people get plugged in? Where are the conversations? Like, it seems like to me that GraphQL is large enough now. It has its own meetups. It probably has its own conferences. But where should people be looking to hear more interesting talks, or to find interesting blog posts, or to find the people that are involved in this space, or to meet other people that are doing this at their companies? Do you guys have any insights into that, or places that you point people?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start, or maybe you can start with what Hazura is doing, and then I'll just talk about.
No, I think we go ahead. I'll build off. Go ahead.
Okay.
You go ahead first.
So I think I think I'll just that are building stuff on top of GraphQL, and I think they working hard about putting resources out there. And eventually, they will end up making money from it, which is great. And I think this is very, very, Apollo is putting out a lot of resources. Prisma is doing a lot of resources. Hazura is putting out a lot of resources. I think the general community is also started putting more and more resources, but I feel like we do kind of lack a central place as a community. And I think this is something that is starting to change. Like, I think that is not, being under an umbrella of a company. Not that I think it's bad, by the way. I think that the fact that companies has financial interest in pushing GraphQL, I think it's amazing. I think we are all here because, many companies had a financial interest to push GraphQL to where it is today. I think that for me, what I try to do is what's missing for me, and what I'm going to release it actually in maybe tomorrow. We just in our group we saw that it's very hard to find one place where you can see everything and touch with your hands and try it out. And so what we're going to release tomorrow is, and maybe, I don't know when the podcast will be out, maybe it's already out, but it's a full WhatsApp clone that is built full stack. There's one version for React with React hooks and one version with Angular. And the backend is the same backend. It uses GraphQL subscriptions, Postgres, TypeORM in one version, and SQLize in another version. And the idea there is just step by step build everything you want, everything you need, and you get a full-blown app. And it's all completely open source, completely free, and we tend to keep it updated. And it's important. And I think hopefully, because it's not under a company or anything like that, other companies would go in and create their own version of that WhatsApp clone. So now you can take the same WhatsApp clone and do it in Hazura, and then you would everything is Git based, so you can see a Git diff between what if you would do everything yourself between how you would do it, for example, with Azure, and then you'll be like, oh, it's like 10,000 lines of code less. So I feel like maybe that's yeah. Again, sorry for promoting it, but again, it's free and you don't need to do you don't need to pay money for it, and we would love actually help from the community. But I hope maybe companies could, show their stuff, and we can really see difference between different stacks and different solutions, and make it very obvious why you would choose it and why you would choose that.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with Uri, and I would go one step further to say that like the amount of content that is currently under the umbrella of companies is actually a bad thing. And always as a founder of a company that is VC backed, I can completely understand the pressure that companies have to say, oh, we're with GraphQL, so we need to do everything with GraphQL, and we need to drive the way GraphQL is being adopted. That's harmful. That's very harmful for the ecosystem, and that's not good. You're going to create more like short-term bad things than good things in the long run. And so the WhatsApp clone, I'm looking forward to it. That would be great. It'll be awesome. I think today, like, people need to go to kind of learn GraphQL and do things. I think because the number of central resources are not like there's not too many collections of central resources, but you pointed out to awesome GraphQL, Lee Byron's talk. All of these places are great places to start. I would recommend the GraphQL Slack. Unfortunately, is not super active, but there's lots of resources online. There's lots of good courses on Egghead that are starting to pop up that I think are just worth kind of going through. So there's all of these traditional forums that people can kind of look at. The best way to get started is still to just build an app, like just build it yourself, and hopefully this WhatsApp clone that Uri's putting out will be on the lines. You'll see more things on the lines of that, which are just full stack, unbiased, completely open source, and then you can start, plugging things out and saying, okay, now I understand why this tool exists and how I can use it to get maximum benefit out of it, right? And I think that kind of stuff will happen gradually, and that's great. But yeah, otherwise, just awesome GraphQL, GitHub resources. All of these places are good places to kind of start browsing and see what you need to do.
Yeah, and even just like to be completely honest, I still think like till today, like one of the best resources and most libraries that you're probably going to end up using is Apollo. So and still the most commented and the most popular place people go to is the Apollo Slack. So for sure you need to be there. For sure you need to go to their website and to their blog post. I would even say, I mean, as someone who worked in Apollo and was in the early days, I think there's a lot of very inspiring, very smart blog posts on the early Apollo blog that I would go to. Maybe, I don't know what's the current state of it, but maybe there's some links on graphql.com. I'm not sure if it's keep being updated again. I think when companies take a charge of some stuff, but at least a while ago, there were a lot of nice links always there, also there in graphql.com and Apollo stuff.
Great. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. And thank you, everybody, for watching this episode of the Modern Web Podcast on GraphQL. I'd like to thank my guests. So Uri Goldshtein, you can find him on Twitter at Uri Goldshtein, which is at URIGOLDSHTEIN. And Tanmai Gopal, who's on Twitter at TanmaiGo, which is TANMAIGO. As always, thank my co-host, Tracy Lee. You can find her online at Lady Leet, LADYLEET. And my name's Rob Ocel. You can find me at Rob Ocel. It's ROBOCELL. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.